All right, strap yourself in your saddles as we continue with the Old Testament, because I am out to dispel biblical ignorance, and I am convinced that most people in the churches in America do not know a lot of these Old Testament stories. So we're going over them briefly, but we're going over them. I also want you to see in the Old Testament Jesus Christ and what he's going to do when he gets here. I also want you to see the future, because the future, when Christ returns, is given to us in the Old Testament. It is merely repeated and expanded upon in the New Testament. Now, of the 929 chapters of the Old Testament, 4,000 years of history, 918 of those chapters are devoted to Israel's history. And we've been looking at that. We've already covered the 1,000 years or so of the years of Israel's history before they had a king. And as of late, we have been talking about Israel's history when God did give them a king. The first 3 kings ruled over all 12 tribes. The nation was united under one king. The first of these was Saul. Saul wasn't a very good king. He was the first. We looked at his victories. We looked at his vices. Samuel reported to him, God is displeased with you because you're more concerned with your agenda than his. And therefore, he is going to replace you with your neighbor who is better than you, who has a heart that is after God's heart. He's concerned with what's on God's mind. And that doesn't mean simply obeying him, but wanting for Israel what God wants for Israel. With me? And that man is David. But David does not become king immediately. In fact, it's probably about 20 years before he becomes king. Meanwhile, ironically, he is Saul's servant. So, this week we're going to discuss the first part of David's years in Saul's ministry. First of all, as Saul's aide. And then we'll address David's years before he becomes king as Saul's adversary. And we're going to watch that transition this morning. Now, David's years as Saul's aide. David came to Saul and entered his service. And look how Saul feels about him. He loved him greatly. Why? Because David did stuff for him. And David became an armor bearer. David was probably one of many armor bearers. He wasn't with Saul constantly as his armor bearer. As the story that we read this morning demonstrated, there were 40 days where the Philistines were lined up against Saul's army and David was not there. He was with the sheep 15 miles away. And Saul sent to Jesse, David's father, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. In other words, whenever I want him, let him come to me, because David still went back and forth. So David had a military role. He also had a musical role, because whenever this evil spirit from God that tormented Saul was upon him, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and all was well, and the evil spirit would depart from Saul. So he has a musical role, he has a military role. Now David, the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, had 8 sons. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, we have this incident in the midst of all this that we read about today. David goes out there and he takes down the Philistines' champion, Goliath. And the picture is kind of inaccurate because how many fingers and toes did Goliath have? Goliath had 6 on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. How many know how many brothers Goliath had? 4. 4 brothers. In case you're wondering why David gathered up 5 stones from the brook, it may have been because he knew there were 4 brothers. So, how did the people react? Let's see how Saul reacted. After David killed Goliath, Saul took him that day and he wouldn't let him return to his father's house. So from now on, David lives with Saul in Gibeah. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. Now don't get the idea that David took Abner's place. Abner was the commander of all of the army. He didn't take Abner's place. This may be more of an administrative role, like our Secretary of Defense here in the United States. And he may have sent spies out to spy out foreign armies and how close they were, and made sure that our army had provisions to do battle. So it may have been something like that. And this was great in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Everybody loves David. You got that? So that's how Saul reacts. When he had finished speaking to Saul after killing Goliath, the soul of Jonathan. Who's Jonathan? Jonathan is Saul's son. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. If Saul, the king, dies, who becomes king in his place? Jonathan, his oldest son. Get that? Jonathan knows this. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. They become best friends. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And why would Jonathan love David? Because they both trust in the Lord for their success. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David. Now, when you made covenants in those days, sometimes you gave people your sandal, sometimes you gave people your outer garment or something like this. It was just kind of a token of, and the person who got it would give it back. I want you to know that the robe, the word for robe here, is often used in the Old Testament to speak of a royal robe. Jonathan is symbolically communicating to David, David, I am not worthy to be the next king of Israel. You are worthy. I'm giving you my robe. What else does he say symbolically? Because he gives him his armor, his sword, his bow, and his girdle. Jonathan wore a girdle. Oh. No, this is just something that held his robe up so he wouldn't trip over it when they ran toward battle or they worked. It was more or less a belt. He's communicating to David, man, you are the man. I have just lost it. It's back? Okay. You, David, are worthy to be the prince of Israel. Now remember, prince was not like we think of prince. We think of a king, and all his sons are what? Princes. When the Old Testament talks about a prince, it's talking about a position of not only command of the country, but command of the army, the warrior, the one who delivers the nation. And David will be the prince of Israel. Okay? And he's saying to David, you are more worthy of that position than I am. So how did the people respond? Well, when David returned from slaying the Philistine, as they were coming home, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul. Not King Saul personally, but King Saul and his army, with timbrels and songs of joy and with instruments of music. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Everybody's happy. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Let's examine that statement. How many people has Saul killed? probably fewer than 100. But he's in charge of all the army, so he gets credit for that. It's also prophetic. This is all you're going to kill as the commander of the army of the Lord. But it is also prophetic of David, because in the future, even though, David, you have killed only one person, you will be responsible for the destruction of 10,000s of God's enemies. You see all this prophetic language in here? And Saul knows. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me only thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? And at that point, it probably dawned on Saul the words of Samuel, God has taken the kingdom from you and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you, who is a man after his own heart. And it has dawned on Saul that God has anointed David to be that man. And Saul kept his eye on David from that point on. The very next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he was raving like a madman within his house while David was playing the lyre. Now get that. What's David doing? He's doing what he was commissioned by God to do at the beginning. Just playing the lyre to comfort Saul while this evil spirit is tormenting him. David could have said, hey, do you know who I am? I'm the guy that killed Goliath. I ain't got time for this musical pussy-wussy stuff. I should be out there fighting Philistines. No, David was content to do what God had assigned him to do. So he's playing the lyre, as he did day by day. And Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled that spear at David, for he thought, I'll pin David to the wall. But David avoided that spear twice. And Saul was afraid. You see the word afraid again? Because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. Folks, is your life characterized by fear? So Saul removed David from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. Wow, David gets a promotion. Well, get this through your heads right now, that every time that Saul does something that seems to be good for David, he has an ulterior motive with David's destruction in mind. And he went out and came in before the people. What does that mean? When people went out to war, people would line the streets as the army left town, wave goodbye, and then when the army came back, they were there in the streets to greet them when they came back. And this is what it means to go in and out before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Every time that Saul does something that he thinks will lead to David's destruction, in other words, hey, if I can't kill him, maybe the Philistines will kill him. And it increases the odds that he's going to die if I get him out there in battle. Every time Saul does something like that, David just gets more successful. Why? Because of the Lord. Because of the Lord. So if people are trying to beat you down, and people are trying to make you not successful, just hang in there. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in, there it is again, fear of David. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before all Israel. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Ooh, that hunky shepherd! Ooh! And this was told to Saul. And so they told Saul, and this thing pleased him, and Saul thought, hey, I'll give my daughter Michal to David. Now, who was he supposed to give to David? You remember the story of Goliath? The king promised his oldest daughter, who is Merab. but he gave her to somebody else. So now the younger daughter loves David, so Saul says, I'll give her to David that she may be a snare for him and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. He's still trying to get David killed. Now, this probably refers back to something in the law of Moses that says if a man has just taken a wife, he is exempt from military duty for a solid year so that he can enjoy his wife and not get distracted, because if he's distracted in the battle, what's going to happen? He's going to get killed. And so that he can raise up offspring so that there will be somebody left behind if he does get killed in battle. All right? So Saul wants David to be distracted. So he says to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you. Lie. And all his servants love you. Truth. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David, and David said, does it seem to you guys a little thing to become the king's son-in-law? This is a big deal. And I am a poor man. What's significant about that? In those days, you paid a purchase price to get a bride. Now when you get a bride, you pay for it afterward. In those days, you negotiated with the father of the girl that you were hoping to marry, and a poor man, like a shepherd, might say, I'll give you 4 or 5 sheep for your daughter. A rich man may say, I'll give you a talent of gold for your daughter. But if the person was a king, you've got to have a significant dowry, a purchase price. You get the idea? But David said, I'm a poor man, and I don't have any reputation. I am a nobody. David, you've been anointed to be the next king of Israel. And David is humble. He still thinks of himself as a nobody. Get the idea? I am not worthy to be the king's son-in-law. Now, there was a person who paid a tremendous purchase price for his bride, and it was Jesus Christ. For a worthless bride, because what were we? We were immoral. We were idolatrous. We were everything bad. And Christ paid the highest price for us, his own life blood for us. And that when we believed in him, what did that blood do for us? It erased our immorality. It erased our idolatry. And as far as the east is from the west, so far has God removed our sins from us. It was a transforming purchase price. So, Saul understands David's position, so he says, say to David, the king desires no bride purchase price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he might be avenged of the king's enemies. Wow. Okay, so the girls are sitting around talking, these wives, and they're doing some of their washing together, because they did things together in those days. And, wow. What did your husband pay for you? Well, my husband gave my father 8 cows. Wow. Rachel, what did your husband pay for you? My husband had to work for my father for 14 years before he could get me, free of charge, to shepherd his sheep. Wow. Michal, we're talking to you. What was the purchase price? Now Saul thought again to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. It seems like he's doing David a favor. But nope. He knows that if he gets him out into battle, that there's another chance that David will get killed in battle. So when David's servants, or when his servants told David these words, it pleased David. Woo-hoo, yeah. Well, to be the king's son-in-law. And before the time had expired, David got up and he went along with his men, and he killed 200 of the Philistines and brought their foreskins. Hello, FedEx. Got a foreskin delivery here. Who wants that duty? I mean, really. David, we killed all these Philistines. Okay, now you know what we got to do? David, you've got to be kidding me. And he paid the king that he might be the king's son-in-law, and Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. So Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Saul was even more afraid of David. Man. And Saul was David's enemy continually. You notice what it does not say? It does not say that David was Saul's enemy continually, because David gave of himself to Saul, even though Saul hated him and sought his life. Why? Because he's being faithful to Yahweh. Now, who appointed Saul? God. Who appointed Joe Biden? If Joe Biden gets to be our president in a few days, and it looks like he probably will, please do not join the rest of the Christians that I've seen out there on Facebook who have got this group going that says Biden is not my president. It doesn't make any difference how a person becomes a leader. God says in Romans chapter 13, there is no authority except from God, and God has appointed those who are in authority. Keep that in mind when you say Joe Biden is not my president. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had even more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. No matter how much Saul wants him to fail, God just keeps making him more successful. And Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. Get this. Johnny, I want you to kill your best friend, who is also your brother-in-law, because he married Johnny's sister. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, is seeking to kill you. You think? Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself, and I'll go out and stand by my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you, and if I learn anything, I'll tell you. Well, on this occasion, Jonathan was able to talk his father out of killing David. But of course, it doesn't end there. An evil spirit came upon Saul from the Lord as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. Now, folks, who sits in his house with his weapon in his hand except somebody who is maniacally paranoid and just overcome with fear and jealousy? And David was playing the lyre, and Saul sought again to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. And guess what? He doesn't come back this time. And Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. She defies her own father, and she let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped, and it would be years before she ever saw her husband again. Johnny's got David hiding out in a field for 3 days to see if he can smooth things over with his daddy again. But Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse," that's David, "to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Now, why in the world is he bringing Jonathan's mother into this? How many of you have seen the movie Smokey and the Bandit? Okay. Jackie Gleason plays this cantankerous old sheriff who is chasing the Burt Reynolds character who is the bandit. And he's got his son along with him in the patrol car, and his son's not all that bright, and he keeps messing up and making mistakes. And at one point in the movie, he looks at his son and he says, "When I get home, the first thing I'm going to do is punch your mother right in the mouth, because I know that somebody as dumb as you did not come from my loins," implying that his mother has been unfaithful. And Saul is saying to Jonathan, if you were really my son, you wouldn't be choosing David over me. For as long, and now he pretends that he's concerned with Jonathan's future, for as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Okay? Because I know that God has anointed David to be the next king. So we got to kill him if you want to be the next king. Is Saul really concerned for Jonathan? Let's see. Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should David be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul threw his spear at Jonathan to strike him. If you're really concerned about your son's future, why do you throw a spear at him? So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. So David rose from behind the place where he was hiding in the field and fell on his face to the ground before Jonathan. David knows he's going to be Jonathan's replacement as king. And he bowed 3 times. He is still humble before Jonathan, his best friend. And they kissed one another, and they wept with one another until David recovered himself. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace. For as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. And so ends David's years as Saul's aide. We should be like David. David's life was ruled by history, as ours should be as well. This is one of the reasons that I'm going over the Old Testament, so that you can see God's history with both the great and the small, the significant and the insignificant. But most of all, you need to be aware of your own history with God. Let me explain what I mean. When David was facing Goliath, he remembered how the Lord had delivered him previously. You remember what we read this morning? David says to Saul, "Hey, when I'm just a little shepherd boy, I have faced a lion, I have faced a bear, and I have destroyed them both. I'm not afraid of this Philistine." Why? Because I remember what the Lord did for me in the past, because David's life was ruled by his history with the Lord. Folks, I was thinking on the way to church this morning of the times that I have lost my jobs at the worst possible points in my life. I didn't have any place to move to. I had no money to move myself if I did have a place. I still had a wife to support. No income. Sometimes thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. And I look back at that, and you know what? I'm still here. Do I look like I'm starving? Do I look like I have no clothes to wear? I look back on my history about how God delivered me. And I start singing the second verse of Amazing Grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far. Grace will lead me home. David's life was ruled by history. Ours should be as well. David's life was also ruled by honor. When facing Goliath, David reminded Goliath that he was there for the Lord's honor. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and a javelin. I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I'm not going to do it. The Lord is going to do it. And I'll strike you down and cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that I am David. No, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Why? Because I serve the living God. Your God, Dagon, is a dead God because he doesn't even exist. David's life was ruled by honor, because when Saul continually mistreated and plotted against him, David never dishonored Saul, his king, even though Saul had done much to deserve it. When Saul continually mistreated and plotted against him, David was never vengeful toward Saul as king, because David's life was ruled by honor. And even though David had been anointed, he never tried to replace Saul, his king, even though he knows he's next in line. It's all a matter of God's time. You remember Moses tried to get ahead of the game to deliver Israel and ended up murdering an Egyptian? And he had to wait 40 years before God was ready for him to deliver Israel out of Egypt. Don't jump the gun. David honored God and his king, and he trusted God's timing for the throne. We should be like David. David's life was ruled by history. David's life was ruled by honor, and David's life was ruled by humility. David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. Abner took him, and how does he respond? I'm just the son of your servant. Oh, I'm the next king of Israel. Nope. David's life is ruled by humility. Saul said to David, "Here's my elder daughter Merab. I'll give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be upon him, but the hand of the Philistines. Let them kill him." But David said to Saul, Who am I? I'm a nobody. And who's my family? We're nobodies, that I should be the son-in-law to the king. And you know, he said the same thing concerning the younger daughter, Michal, because David's life was ruled by humility. God gives more grace. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Likewise, you that are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Why is the verse before that have to do with the elders, the leaders of the church? Because especially today, there are people who claim to be Christians who will refuse to become accountable to the church and the church leadership. And they say, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian. Well, you kind of do. Yeah. And if you're that proud that you will not hold yourself accountable to your fellow brothers and sisters and to church leadership, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Father, thank